Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Welcome to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, a show where I interview guests that teach, motivate, and inspire. Today, I am joined by the president and founder of the American Small Business League, Lloyd Chapman. Lloyd has battled for over 30 years to expose the rampant fraud and abuse of the federal government's small business contracting program. He is the nation's most vocal opponent of the federal government's policy, including fabricating the 23% small business contracting goal. So we're going to be talking to him about what that is and what his organization does. So Lloyd, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, it's an honor to be on your show. Thank you very much.
Well, why don't you start off by giving everybody a little bit of background about yourself, telling people who you are.
Well, my name is Lloyd Chapman, and I'm the president and founder of the American Small Business League. I founded that group about 20 years ago to help support the largest economic stimulus program for the American people, which is the Small Business Act. And that law mandates that a minimum of 23% of all federal contracts go to small businesses. I started suing the government to expose fraud in those programs about 33 years ago. And I've been doing it ever since. It's been quite interesting.
Well, what is the difference between the American Small Business League and the Small Business Association, the SBA?
It's kind of like saying what's the difference between the Marines and the Taliban. Here's something that most people don't know. I'll kind of repeat that. The largest economic stimulus program ever passed by Congress for the American people is the Small Business Act. And the Small Business Administration is supposed to monitor that. But the SBA is a federal agency. Oh, I don't want to get too political, but I believe that large corporations have a great deal of power in directing our government. And so for about 30 years, the Small Business Administration has actually not been what people think they are. They're not there to help small businesses. As a federal agency, they're there to help the federal government and whoever the president is. So for 3 decades, the Small Business Administration has really been a major opponent for small businesses that are trying to participate in these federal small business contracting programs. I remember in one lawsuit, I was under the Freedom of Information Act, I asked the SBA to give me the names of all the firms that they claim received small business contracts for that particular year. They wouldn't give it to me. I sued them and I won. And during the litigation, the SBA claimed not to have any information on who received federal contracts. So when I won the case, Judge Marilyn Patel out of the San Francisco federal court said it was curious the SBA claims not to have the very information they would need to carry out their mission. In another recent case I won, a federal judge accused them of suppressing evidence and covering up evidence. So the SBA is really, contrary to most people's opinion, not a pro-small business organization. The American Small Business League is. But that's the main difference.
And tell us how so.
I guess in 2001, early 2001, a young lady that was working with lost a small business set-aside contract. And that's a contract that is only supposed to be bid out to small businesses. And she worked on it for several weeks and lost it to a company in Amsterdam with 26,000 employees around the world in 28 countries. And again, under federal law, that contract was only supposed to be given to small businesses. So I thought that was kind of crazy. So I went to the Small Business Administration's database of small businesses at that time, which was called ProNet. And I found pretty much every Fortune 500 firm in the country in there, a lot of overseas corporations. And I called everybody in Washington. I called the FBI and I called everybody. And finally, the Government Accountability Office called me back. I gave them all the information I compiled. And they launched an investigation. And they found that the SBA had over 5,300 Fortune 1,000 firms in their database of small businesses. And there was a congressional investigation. I testified for Congress. And it came out that they were knowingly diverting these funds that were supposed to go to small businesses and minority-owned small businesses and woman-owned small businesses to some of the biggest companies in the world. And that came out in 2001.
This next question is a two-part question. The first part is, I think I saw that you had over 110 Freedom of Information acts against the government. So tell us about the successes. I know you talked a little bit about it that you've had against them, and also tell us about if you've had any repercussions or backlashes for exposing them for what they've been doing.
All right. Well, my attorneys tell me that I've won more Freedom of Information Act legal battles against the government than anyone in history. I've won 110. And over 33 years, my win ratio was 98.5%. And I think that's also a record. And it's exposed hundreds and hundreds of billions in fraud in federal small business programs. It's exposed how the federal government has fabricated compliance with the 23% small business goal that's mandated by the Small Business Act. And it exposed lots of fraud at the Pentagon and with some of the nation's largest prime contractors. I've also stopped efforts out there to close the SBA. So here's a statistic that might shock people. 99% of all the companies in America have less than 500 employees. So only 1% have over 500 employees. And according to the U.S. Census Bureau data, those companies with less than 500 employees are responsible for just about 100% of all the net new jobs, half the gross domestic product, half the private sector workforce, and the majority of U.S. exports. So those companies with, I think there's about 33, 34 million companies in that category across the country. And that's where most Americans work. And today in government, 97% of all federal spending goes to that 1% that, according to the Census Bureau, haven't created one net new job since 1980. And many of them pay no taxes. So you can just Google Fortune 500 firms, not paying taxes, and see all the stories out there about that. So I think that's appalling, and nobody knows about that. And I've been able to expose that. And in terms of the repercussions, it's like something out of a science fiction movie, right? You can imagine what the federal government does when you go into court for 33 years and expose all this fraud and abuse. Yeah, the things they've done is just astounding. I call it the Iron Dome. So in 2013, I used to eat granola for breakfast, and I'd sit there at the kitchen table and I would Google my name because people would write stories about me and not even talk to me. And I thought that was really interesting. So almost every day there'd be some stories about me, out there. And if I Googled my name, there'd be about 50 or 60 pages of just stories about Lloyd Chapman, the American Small Business League. And one morning I got up and I Googled my name and I was gone. There was no mention of me on the internet at all. That happened in June of 2013. And I got a letter from Business Wire, so they no longer run my press releases. I was very popular in the Huffington Post. I used to talk to Ariana Huffington, when she was at home. I got a letter from the Huffington Post that I was dropped as a blogger. I was dropped as a blogger from all the blogs I was blogging on. All my media appearances just stopped from one day to the next. So what the government does is they hire what's called a reputation management firm. So for example, I think when BP, when their oil well blew up in the Gulf Coast, they hired a big international reputation management firm to try to, spin that and make it look like it wasn't as bad as it was. Harvey Weinstein hired a reputation management firm to try to kill stories about him. And, they're very good at what they do. They just pretty much, kind of shut me down. And I sponsor the Palm Springs International Documentary Film Festival. And every year I'd meet filmmakers from around the world, and people would talk to me about making a documentary about me. I talked to Robert Redford's son, Jamie Redford, about that, and he was very interested in that. And when I would go back to the film festival every year, people would tell me, I've been trying to call you for a year. They say, I've called your office dozens of times and the phone just rings. And I discovered that they had somehow compromised my phone system. So when people tried to reach me, the phone just rang. And it was like, like we had gone out of business, right? That happens to this day. In fact, quite frankly, I was surprised that this your podcast went through. The last 3 podcasts I was supposed to do were canceled about 2 hours before they went through. Back, I guess, in the past, I would go to San Francisco downtown to go do a spot for CNN or ABC or NBC, and about 30 minutes before the interview, I would get a call that had been canceled. So the government does not want anyone, whether you're an activist for Black Lives Matter or small businesses or animal rights, if you're opposing anything that the federal government is doing or anything that Fortune 500 firms that work with the government are doing, they want to shut you up. In fact, I would advise your listeners to go watch some documentaries on Amazon called Truth and Power. And there's 10 20-minute documentaries. And in those documentaries, it shows how any type of activist that's involved with the government, where you're using the Freedom of Information Act or whatever, they want to shut you down. And that goes back, by the way, back into the 50s. I think on Netflix right now, there's 2 documentaries about how the FBI hounded and harassed Martin Luther King. One's called MOK FBI. And there was a civil rights activist, Jean Seberg. And they hounded her until she committed suicide. So there's a clear pattern out there of the government trying to silence whistleblowers. The Black Lives Matter movement is a typical example. Anytime there's a Black Lives Matter protest, protest or rally, it's overflown by U.S. government predator drone with what's called a stingray, and they upload everyone's cell phones. Have you heard about that at all? Have you seen that?
I have not heard of that, but tell us about it so people know.
Well, if there's a device called a stingray, like a Corvette Stingray, and it's used to upload all the data from your cell phone. In the documentary, the first one, I think, is about Black Lives Matter, the Truth and Power documentaries. And in the documentary, it shows a black van driving along next to the protesters, and they somehow were able to get the radio transmissions from the police in the van to the headquarters, talking about how they were downloading all the protesters' cell phone data and finding out, what they were going to do and where they're going to take the demonstration. Then it came out on national television, I'd say 6 months ago. Then after the George Floyd murder, there was a big protest, and how U.S. government predator drones overflew the protesters, and with a sophisticated stingray device, uploaded all their cell phones. You can probably Google, Black Lives Matter, stingray predator drones and see that story. But I saw it on CNN. But anytime anyone is opposing the government, they try to shut you up. My dad was in the CIA, and 50 years ago, I went to the kitchen. I was visiting them up in Warrenton, Virginia. I went to the kitchen to get some water, and he was sitting at the kitchen table. He was very upset, and he started talking to me, and the stuff he told me sounded so outrageous, I thought he had a stroke. And he told me that anytime anyone sues the government, that they tap their phone and went through their mail. And that was half a century ago, he told me that. And of course, at that point in time, I was 21. I had no intention of, suing the government. That's the furthest thing from my mind. But I think he was upset because he was he was involved in surveillance and designing equipment where intelligence people could communicate and the Russians couldn't pick up the signals. And I think he might have been forced to get involved in what I'll call domestic surveillance. And I think it upset him, because he was very upset that night. But he told me that half a century ago, that if you sue the government, they tap your phone and monitor their mail. So you can imagine what they do, these days, right, with the internet and cell phones.
Yeah, well, they just came out and said that they could monitor people's text messages. So yeah, it's not a surprise. Yeah,
well, that's what Edward Snowden, exposed the mass, surveillance. A number of government whistleblowers have talked about that. Edward Snowden was one of them. Thomas Drake and Thomas Tam were whistleblowers that talked about that. But yeah, so the government's repercussions against me. I mean, I could talk about that for a week. All the things that have happened, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but it's again, it might sound difficult to believe, but if you go to Amazon and watch Truth and Power, there's also been documentaries out there on PBS called United States of Secrets. A film came out a few years ago called The War on Whistleblowers. You can also just Google The War on Whistleblowers or go to Wikipedia and search on whistleblowers. I've got I printed out the stack the other day for another podcast. It's a half-inch thick of whistleblowers. I'll tell you something fascinating that I learned. You know when the Whistleblower Protection Act was passed? 1777. I was completely stunned when I saw that. 1777. Some revolutionary officers reported that another officer was torturing British prisoners. And that guy, you know, tried to sue the officers that were exposing him. And that's when Congress first passed the first Whistleblower Protection Act was in 1777. Yeah, so yeah, it's unfortunate. There's supposed to be laws in place to protect, you know, whistleblowers, both civilian people like me and people who work for the government. But if you go out and look at, you know, people that have done that, they, you know, bad things happen to them.
Well, let me ask you, have you ever worked with Project Veritas or got any of your information to them?
No, I've heard that name. There's a lot of organizations in Washington that are supposed to be sort of doing what I do. But again, after 33 years and 110 legal victories, no one has ever stepped forward to help me. No one. There are dozens of groups out there that claim to represent small businesses. But if you go on the internet and look at government small business contracting fraud or Fortune 500 firms getting federal small business contracts, you're just going to see me and the American small business. You won't see any of the organizations that people think are there to help small businesses. I was very disappointed, by the way, a number of times, and I met with people in Washington for different groups. Taking on the Pentagon is something nobody wants to do. Everybody's afraid of the Pentagon. I think people in Congress are afraid of the Pentagon. And nobody wants to do that. Everybody's afraid of the Pentagon. But I'm not.
Like Joe Biden said, they got nuclear weapons. So you know how that goes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you want an idea of the Pentagon's power, your listeners can Google 21 trillion missing from the Pentagon or 6.5 trillion missing from the Pentagon. I believe right now, the latest report that I saw, and I heard Joe Rogan talking about it, is it looks like over $21 trillion is missing from the Pentagon. They can't find it, can't account for it. And yet, most of your listeners have never heard that. It wasn't on CNN, it wasn't on ABC, or it wasn't in the New York Times or the Washington Post. That story was completely covered up. But you can find it on the internet. I remember the summer of 2016, the Inspector General for the Pentagon came out and said that the Pentagon could not account for 6.5 trillion. And you can go onto the internet and search on 2.3 trillion missing from the Pentagon. The day before 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld gave a speech. And he said America's biggest enemy was not Russia or China or North Korea. It was the Pentagon bureaucracy. That's on my website, by the way. You go to ASBL.com and look on the media page. It's under videos. And you can listen to Donald Rumsfeld's speech the day before 9/11, saying that the biggest threat to the lives of the people in the United States of America and men and women in uniform is the Pentagon bureaucracy. And the 2.3 trillion was missing. And that number now is 10 times bigger than that. It's over 21 trillion. But the Pentagon's very powerful. Too bad. It's quite frankly, it's too bad that the very agency that's supposed to protect us, according to Donald Rumsfeld, might be potentially one of our biggest enemies.
Well, let's talk about small businesses during the pandemic. What did you see, and how did small businesses get affected over this past 18 months or 16 months?
What I saw was very typical. very typical in that when the government passed the PPP program, the payroll protection program, I got phone calls from small businesses all across the country that couldn't get any money. And I sued the government and ultimately won. They forced to release the information to me. And most of the money went to some very, very big businesses. The largest recipient of the PPP program, the purpose of the PPP program was to give people loans and money so they wouldn't lay off their employees, right? The payroll protection plan. So it was to basically subsidize small businesses that were struggling to keep people employed. And yet the largest recipient of the PPP money was a billionaire that owned a chain of hotels around the country. And he laid off 95% of his people, and he got $30.1 million. So when you look at who got the money, oh gosh, the band, the Eagles, got money. I think the LA Lakers got money, just ridiculous stuff, But unfortunately, it didn't go to small businesses. And I've seen it reported on the national media that up to a third of all the small business in America are gone forever. And the area that I live in, I see that. So when I drive down the street not too far from my house where most of the businesses are, I saw them go out of business. Well, I saw them struggling. Then I saw them go out of business. And then I saw the business, the building go up for lease. So think about this. During the pandemic, the United States government adopted policies where you couldn't shop at a small business, but you could shop at Target and Walmart and Home Depot and Office Depot. Does that make any sense to you? You're
That's
much
exactly
more likely.
What they done.
Yeah. So if you're trying to, let's just look at this logically. If you're trying to put as many small businesses out of business as possible, you want to take all the federal funds that's supposed to go to small businesses under the small business and give it to Fortune 500 firms and their subsidiaries. And when the pandemic hit, you adopt a policy where you cannot go into a small business and buy anything. You've got to buy it from a Fortune 500 firm. And that killed, millions and millions of small businesses. But I was in Kmart during the pandemic, and it was packed. It was packed, right? Everyone you were forced to go there. I kind of don't think that was an accident. I don't believe the government is that stupid. It had to be intentional, right? But it just devastated small businesses. And again, statistics are small business responsible for pretty much 100% of all the net new jobs, half the gross domestic product, half the private sector workforce, and most of U.S. exports. And our government's policies, I would describe them as anti-small business. And think about this. Again, 99% of all U.S. firms have less than 500 employees. 1% have over 500 employees. The agency that represents small businesses at the SBA, here's something that's going to shock people. The Small Business Administration has essentially been closed. They've cut the budget to the point that agency, really can't operate any longer. Think about a federal agency that's in place to help over 30 million small businesses, and their budget is less than $1 billion a year. Now you look at the agency to help big businesses, the 1%, and that agency's budget is $10 billion. That kind of tells you how the government feels about small businesses, right? The agency to help the 30 million small businesses where most Americans work, the budget is less than $1 billion. And the agency to help Fortune 500 firms that haven't created one job since 1980 is $10 billion a year. So, the federal government's policies towards small business during the pandemic were devastating. And I don't think we'll ever recover, quite frankly. I don't think this country will ever recover.
Well, how do you feel like we can support small businesses despite the government's anti-small business policies? What's the biggest thing that we can do as a country to support small businesses?
If you're going to buy something, go buy from a small business. Don't go to Kmart or Target or Walmart. go to a small business and buy it from them. If this country loses our small business economic base, I think our economy is going to collapse. I really do. Think about it. Let's just look at it logically. What do you think is going to happen in the next decade when the federal government is spending 97% of all of our tax dollars, yours and mine, with 1% of the companies that hadn't created one job since 1980 and many of them pay no taxes? And they're turning their back on the 99% of all American companies where most Americans work and all the jobs are created. I think that I just can't imagine that the economy can go on, quite frankly, much longer like that. We're also 28 trillion in debt, right? So America's $28 trillion in debt. We're spending 97% of all our tax dollars with less than 1% of US firms that don't create jobs, and many don't pay taxes. Some of the biggest corporations in the country don't pay taxes. Again, Google, Fortune 500 that don't pay taxes, and there's just, dozens and dozens of stories. So buy from a small business. And, I hate to say this because I'm kind of addicted to buying things online myself, right? But, stop buying things online and, get in your car, drive down the street and buy from a small business. I think banks and lending institutions should be more pro small business, more small business friendly. I think if I could talk to President Biden, I know that he wants to help the economy. And I would encourage President Biden to reopen the Small Business Administration. In the last, I'll say 15, 20 years, they closed 90% of the offices around the country. 20 years ago, there were SBA offices all around the country in smaller cities. And I would reopen the SBA and I would take the budget from, less than $1 billion. I would make it, quite frankly, if I were president, I would make it 30 billion. Take 30 billion from the Pentagon. I saw they're going to spend 25 billion to put a woman on the moon. Once you take that 25 billion and invest it in the small businesses where most Americans work, we'll just pass on putting a woman on the moon, right? Yeah, it's crazy when you think about it. Just look at the numbers, and it makes no sense. It's completely upside down. The federal government is. But again, I've lobbied Congress for 20 years. I've been in every office in the House and the Senate. I've met, I think, almost every president, since Reagan, and I've been all around Washington. I've written legislation that was introduced into Congress 3 times. I wrote a bill called the Fairness and Transparency in Contracting Act, and all it said was the government won't count contracts to Fortune 500 firms as small business contracts. It never made it out of committee. It was introduced 3 times by Congressman Hank Johnson, never made it out of committee. And I would think that 100% of Americans agree with me that Fortune 500 firms shouldn't get federal small business contracts, and yet you can't get a bill passed that would make that a law. But small businesses need our help. They're in trouble. They're in big trouble. Yeah, I don't think that if President Biden doesn't do something, I'll be very disappointed in him. If he doesn't do something about that, I'll be very disappointed. But we'll see.
Do you have any upcoming projects that you're working on at the time that people need to know about?
Well, I've got 3 lawsuits against the government right now. I'm getting ready to file a 4th one. I'm trying to prove that the government's cheating small businesses by, under the Freedom of Information Act, against the Office of Management Budget, trying to get them to show me documents to show how much the government spends. I've worked with Professor Charles Tiefer, who is probably the nation's leading expert on federal contracting law, and another expert, Ashok Mehan out of DC. He's got a company called FedMine. They both agree the government spends about $1.5 trillion a year. And that would mean that small business should be getting around $350 billion. But when you look at the press releases from the SBA, when they claim they hit that 23% goal, they're excluding about 2/3 of all federal spending from that number. So I'm trying to force the SBA and the Office of Management Budget to give me that data. I'm just trying to, do as much media as I can and try to get this message out there. Like I said, in 2013, again, you can go to YouTube and search on Lloyd Chapman. And I used to be on I've been on every national TV news program there is, I think. I was on ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, Fox Business. I was even on international television. I was on RTTV, which was the second largest TV news network in the world. And that's all been shut down. And today I'm just trying to get on podcasts and radio shows and talk, about this and get it out there. I'm trying to get on the Joe Rogan show. I think if I could get on one of the bigger podcasts like that it might potentially lead to some favorable federal policies that would save, millions of small businesses. I'll tell you something. Here's something I'll throw out. Here's a project I'm working on. And again, tell me what you think about this. Based upon all the data I've gotten in 33 years of lawsuits, legal opinions from the nation's leading experts on federal contract and all, like Professor Charles Tiefer, it looks like small businesses are getting 3% of all federal contracts, not 23. So they're 20% short. A few years ago, the Senate Small Business Committee conducted a study that said for every 1% contracts of small businesses went up, it created 100,000 net new jobs a year. So when you look at the data that shows that small businesses are getting cheated out of 20%, or they're 20% short, if the government would give small businesses 20%, according to the study from the Senate, that would create 2 million new jobs a year. The United States of America is only claiming to be creating about 2.5 million jobs a year. So if I could prevail and get them to give small business the full 23%, that would be an 80% increase in jobs for this country. Now, here's something that I didn't know until a couple of years ago. When you look at the stock market and world markets, they rise and fall based upon the monthly jobs report out of the Labor Department. So the stock market here in America and world markets around the world look at the monthly jobs report as an indication of the strength of the U.S. economy. So if they're projected to create 250,000 jobs, for example, in July, and they only do 200, well, the stock market goes down. I remember walking by a newspaper stand one day, and I saw that the Federal Reserve policy is based on the jobs report. So if the stock market and world markets rise and fall based upon a 5 to 10% fluctuation in the jobs report, think what would happen if it went up 80%. I think that could potentially prompt a worldwide economic boom. So if the jobs report is down, the stock market drops. If it's better than expected, it goes up. Think what it'd be like if it went up 80%. So I think I've got a solution to saving the U.S. economy. Just quit cheating small businesses. Do what the law that was passed during Dwight Eisenhower's presidency says, and give small business 23% of all federal contracts. And that's what I call deficit neutral, no new spending, no new taxes, and double the number of net new jobs in America. That's the main project I'm working on, is trying to get that message out.
And I think that's a great message. Go ahead and throw out your contact information so people can contact you.
All right. My website is ASBL.com. And I've got LloydChapman.net and LloydChapman.com. And you can go on YouTube and search my name and see all my media appearances. And I would encourage your listeners to, this will be the third time I've said it, realize the Small Business Act is the largest economic stimulus program for the American people in history. And, write your congressman, call your congressman and tell them that you'd like them to reopen the Small Business Administration and end the fraud and abuse in federal small business programs and give our nation's small businesses the money that the law says they should get. And if enough people get together and do that, it might make a difference. It could help.
Are you on social media?
Yeah. I have to say I do a little social media. My office people do that, but I'm mainly, quite frankly, my time is occupied with my my lawsuits and talking to lawyers and working with all that stuff. That's something that I got to work on a daily basis. I'm really proud. I'll tell you something I'm proud of. Federal District Court Judge William Alsop, in one of my most recent cases, described me as being in a David and Goliath battle against big government, big business. And he accused the government in that case of suppressing evidence and covering up evidence. I'm really happy. Here's something he said. This is a direct quote from a transcript. So be more like a David and Goliath. You get to come in there and be the underdog again against the big company, against the big business, and talking about the government. They're trying to suppress the evidence, right? And that's one of the most famous federal judges in the country, Judge William Alsup. He's the one that struck down Trump's program against Dreamers. Here's something else he said. I like this. The purpose of the Freedom of Information Act is so the public can see how our government works. Congress passed this law to make small businesses have access to some of these projects, and here's the United States covering it up. So one of the most preeminent federal judges has described me as being a David and Goliath battle against big business, and accused the federal government of suppressing evidence and covering up evidence and trying to cover up evidence in this program. I consider that one of my proudest accomplishments, by the way, to have that judge say that. But so yeah, people, go to the website and look at it and watch some of my TV appearances, and people should take your podcast and send it out to everybody they know. That'll help. And send that to all your friends on Facebook.
Absolutely. And Lloyd Chapman, I would like to take this time to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me today.
Well, thank you so much. Again, I'm very honored to be on your show. You're doing a lot of good work, and I'm so glad that you will allow me to come on your show and tell my little story.
Well, listeners, as Lloyd said, please be sure to share, follow, rate, and review after listening. And for you Android users, go to the Google Play Store and download the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast app. For more information on the Living the Dream podcast, visit www.djcurveball.com. Until next time, stay focused on living the dream.